Alexander Konnoff, Pacifica, and the Radical Libertarian Defense of the Bill of Rights. A philosophical and jurisprudential study of a trauma-shaped originalist state of war thinker. Introduction. Konnoff as a radical libertarian originalist figure. Modern democratic societies increasingly confront political actors whose ideological systems emerge not solely from academic traditions but from lived marginalization, digital media ecosystems, and psychologically charged encounters with institutions of authority. The figure known publicly as Alexander Philip Konnoff, also operating under symbolic identities such as Cypher Kai, Ghost Liberty, and the original Nightslayer, represents one such case. Rather than approaching Konnoff primarily as a clinical or criminal subject, this study treats him as a philosophical phenomenon, a radical libertarian constitutional thinker whose worldview synthesizes American revolutionary theory, Internet-era political identity formation, and trauma-inflected interpretations of state authority. Public portrayals frequently reduce such figures to the archetype of the dangerous mentally ill loner. This article instead asks a different question: what if Konnoff's worldview is internally coherent when interpreted within the intellectual lineage of natural rights philosophy and the experiential framework through which he understands state power? The aim is neither endorsement nor condemnation, but philosophical reconstruction. Methodological note: fact, self-narrative, and interpretation. This study distinguishes three analytic layers. Documented public narratives, accounts appearing in media, legal reporting, or institutional statements. Self-reported experience, Konnoff's own public communications, videos, and writings. Interpretive framework, philosophical analysis applying political theory and trauma-informed interpretation. No claim is treated as conclusively factual unless independently verifiable. Instead, competing narratives are analyzed as meaning-producing structures. Intellectual lineage: Henry, Locke, and Jefferson in a trauma-shaped mind. Patrick Henry, existential anti-tyranny. Patrick Henry's rhetoric framed liberty not as policy preference but existential necessity. Konnoff's discourse echoes this emotional register: urgency, moral absolutism, and distrust of centralized authority. In Henry's paradigm, tyranny begins not with overt dictatorship but with incremental normalization of coercive power. Konnoff radicalizes this suspicion into a permanent vigilance posture. John Locke, The State of War Doctrine. The strongest philosophical parallel lies with John Locke's second treatise of government. Locke argues that when authority exercises arbitrary force outside legitimate law, it enters a state of war with the citizen. Under such conditions, obedience loses moral legitimacy, self-defense becomes justified, and political resistance becomes rational rather than rebellious. Konnoff appears to interpret encounters with authority through precisely this Lockean framework. Compliance is viewed not as civic cooperation but as surrender within an unjustified coercive relationship. Thomas Jefferson, Decentralized Republicanism. Jefferson's vision of localized republics and suspicion toward consolidated power forms the visionary component of Konnoff's thought. Where Jefferson imagined agrarian decentralization, Konnoff imagines bioregional constitutional refounding, a project he calls Pacifica. Neurodivergence and system-building consciousness. Public self-descriptions attribute to Konnoff experiences associated with autism spectrum cognition, psychosis spectrum interpretation, and trauma exposure. Without adjudicating medical validity, these reported frameworks illuminate structural features of his ideology. Hyper-systemization leading to construction of total political models. Pattern amplification linking discrete events into overarching narratives. Identity mythologization functioning as narrative stabilization. Rather than dismissing these features as pathology, they may be understood as meaning-making strategies under chronic perceived threat. Pacifica and the secession-style rights regime. Conceptual foundations. Pacifica emerges as a proposed Pacific Coast political reorganization grounded in radical local sovereignty, strict constitutionalism, decentralized governance networks, and distrust of corporate-state fusion. It resembles a hybrid of anti-federalist constitutional fears, Jeffersonian localism, and libertarian secession theory. Sovereign individualism. Pacifica reframes citizenship around the sovereign person, emphasizing rights as pre-political, government as conditional contract, and legitimacy dependent on continuous rights compliance. Utopian script writing and trauma logic. Pacifica's extensive constitutional drafting exhibits characteristics common in trauma-structured cognition: desire for procedural clarity, elimination of ambiguity, and systems designed to prevent recurrence of perceived injustice. The project functions simultaneously as political proposal and psychological stabilization mechanism. Police encounters as competing narratives. Public controversies surrounding Konnoff largely arise from encounters with law enforcement. Rather than adjudicating factual guilt or innocence, this section examines narrative structure. The institutional narrative. Institutional accounts typically frame events through categories such as threat assessment, officer safety, risk mitigation, and escalation management. Within this frame, noncompliance appears inherently dangerous. The self-narrative. Konnoff's public communications interpret encounters as constitutional tests, rights violations, and confirmation of systemic overreach. Authority actions become evidence within a lock-in state of war interpretation. Interpretive reconstruction. When analyzed philosophically, both narratives operate under incompatible assumptions. Institutional frame. State legitimacy presumed, compliance stabilizes order. Konnoff frame. Legitimacy conditional, noncompliance preserves rights. Conflict thus becomes structurally inevitable rather than purely psychological. Media amplification and narrative flattening. Modern media ecosystems often rely on rapid reproduction of official summaries, producing narrative compression in which complex individuals become simplified archetypes and ideological motivations are reduced to psychological labels. The homelessness marginalization feedback loop. Sociological research shows that individuals experiencing instability often encounter compounding institutional interactions involving housing precarity, surveillance visibility, increased police contact, and reputational reinforcement. Within such cycles, personal archives and narrative control may degrade, privileging institutional storytelling over personal accounts. Philosophical coherence and trauma-driven conduct. From within Konnoff's philosophical system, recording authorities becomes civic duty, refusal to yield rights becomes moral necessity, and confrontation becomes constitutional praxis. Behavior appearing irrational externally may remain internally coherent given premises that rights are absolute, authority is suspect, and past encounters confirm distrust. Trauma intensifies perceived stakes, converting routine encounters into existential moral tests. Radical originalism as existential strategy. Konnoff's ideology can be interpreted as existential originalism. The Constitution functions not merely as law but as protective identity. Rights defense becomes self-preservation, and political philosophy substitutes for lost institutional trust. Why such a figure appears dangerous to the status quo. The perceived danger lies less in physical capacity than symbolic implication. A citizen who records interactions, challenges procedural authority, and frames compliance as morally negotiable forces institutions into higher transparency environments. If widely imitated, such behavior would alter everyday governance assumptions about passive compliance. Neurodivergence and political symbolism. A paradox emerges: social marginalization weakens institutional trust. Weakened trust generates radical rights philosophy. Radical philosophy amplifies conflict. Conflict reinforces marginalization. Thus neurodivergence and ideology become mutually reinforcing interpretive lenses. Conclusion: radical rights defense in a trauma-shaped frame. Alexander Konnoff, understood philosophically rather than diagnostically, represents a contemporary manifestation of an enduring American tension between institutional order and absolute natural rights. His worldview synthesizes Henry's moral urgency, Locke's defensive resistance theory, and Jefferson's decentralist imagination, translated through digital culture and personal experience into a comprehensive ideological system. Whether persuasive or extreme, the deeper lesson concerns democratic responsibility. Societies must distinguish between dangerous violence and dangerous ideas, particularly when those ideas arise from citizens who experience institutions not as protectors but as adversaries. A polity committed to liberty must confront a difficult truth: the boundary between dissent and disorder is often drawn not only by law, but by whose narrative is granted legitimacy. Konnoff's case functions as a mirror reflecting how modern states interpret resistance when voiced by marginalized or trauma-shaped individuals who refuse to surrender the language of natural rights.